It's a tradition.
You guys are gonna regret this by the time it's over. Also, before we actually get into talking about Final Fantasy 16 here, I need to offer a brief apology. I tried to produce this video as quickly as I could because I'm working on some other stuff right now. I wanted to kind of get this done quickly and out of the way. So I just used webcam, a couple of other things to actually shoot the bulk of the video, which you'll be seeing in a moment. I'm shooting this bit after I've shot the rest of it because I had some problems with my microphone. Some settings somehow got reset, and I didn't notice until afterwards. There's a little bit of hiss in the background during the audio of me actually talking about this trailer. I apologize for that. Hopefully it won't happen again in the future, but I really do not feel like reshooting this entire thing, so I apologize. It's going to be a little bit of that background noise during this video. Okay, everybody, we're going to take a bit of a look at this Final Fantasy 16 trailer that came out. How long ago did this come out? A week ago? About 2 weeks ago? Whatever, it doesn't matter. If you've just clicked on this video by complete happenstance and you don't know who I am, parts of this are probably going to be a little bit confusing. Honestly, it's going to be probably maybe a little bit more confusing if you're actually familiar with some of my past work. So if you don't know, I did some videos about Final Fantasy 15 back in the day before that game came out, and I used to do trailer analysis and things like that occasionally. I don't really do that anymore for a number of reasons. One of the big ones being that I don't particularly enjoy doing that. You see, back in the ancient times of 2013, when Final Fantasy 15 was initially unveiled at E3, or I guess not initially unveiled, re-unveiled, that was part of the problem, there was mass confusion and mass hysteria. What is this game? How does it work? I wasn't keeping up with Versus 13, so I just got thrown into all this and I don't really know what's going on. And at the time, I was, I guess I'm still a nerd. That hasn't really changed. But I had been following Versus 13 relatively closely, during the times when it actually existed, the 2 years prior to 2013, to the reveal, 2013 and 2012. We didn't really see anything of it, of course. But I had enough familiarity with the project that I thought I'll make a quick video where I explain a little bit of the backstory of the development of the game and what we actually know about the product. Now, of course, a lot of that information wound up being completely irrelevant to the game that we eventually got, but that was the video that I made at the time. My YouTube channel didn't really exist yet. That was essentially the first thing that I ever did. And I got kind of lucky. You see, at the time, I actually posted that initial Final Fantasy 15 video that I did back in the day on screwattack.com. This is back when, Screw Attack was a website, and it actually got posted on their front page as like their as the user made news coverage of Final Fantasy 15, because they would sometimes post user made content as their news coverage, and that resulted in me getting a couple thousand views, even though that video was put out into the void of the internet on a channel with no subscribers and no viewership and whatnot. So the fact that the point is, I put that video out with the expectation of getting absolutely nothing, and I wound up getting a little bit of something. So since that was what I had some form of viewership, I decided to roll with that for a while. So I made more videos about Final Fantasy 15 for a little while as kind of more news came out. And I did trailer analysis things for a couple of other video games along the way because people seemed to like it when I did it for that. But that's never really been something that I was super duper zeroed in on and into. It may have seemed that way, but you got to understand that if you go back and watch any of those really in-depth trailer analysis videos that I did, it wasn't that I spent hours and hours staring at the video and dissecting it. It was that I watched the video maybe 3 or 4 times, and then I just I had it. To me, the stuff that I talked about in those videos wasn't ever really like a major revelation where I was like, okay, we're now really going to break down into the tiny details. It was just kind of the stuff that I saw, which is why it was relatively easy for me to make those videos back in the day. Then, of course, Final Fantasy 15 went on. We got tons of gameplay footage. We got a demo. So I stopped covering it. And I stopped doing trailer analysis stuff in general because it just wasn't something that I was terribly interested in doing. But the good news is, we're here today talking about the Final Fantasy 16 reveal trailer, and we're not doing trailer analysis. We're just talking about the trailer. Because, you see, there's not really a ton here with this trailer to discuss in the first place. this is the type of thing where people are, flying off doing story speculation, trying to go into all this detail about, we don't have any information yet. We don't know anything about this. I'm not going to waste my time, going into repeating all the dialogue that the characters are saying and suggesting what I think they might be talking about. To me, that's a waste of time. I'm not interested in that. We're just going to talk about some stuff that I find kind of neat about this, and what I find interesting about the tiny bits of news that have come out about this game so far. And I'm going to also probably discuss a little bit the reaction to this trailer, because some of the things that people have been saying about this trailer so far, some people are upset about stupid things. So if you're watching this, I'm assuming that you've already seen the trailer at this point, so the obvious things out of the gate. It's an action game. We're seeing a little bit of blood this time around. I saw somewhere on Twitter that someone was saying the game was already rated Sero 18 or whatever. I don't know how it could be rated this early on in the stage, so I think that was just somebody mocking something up for Twitter, though it seems pretty obvious that this game is going to be rated M. The trailers are age-restricted. There's blood everywhere. You can see when he's punching this guy here, when he's hitting this knight, there is, if we back it up slightly, even in just your basic, combo hits, not even in cutscenes, in your basic, when you're hitting these enemies with a sword, you can see blood squirt out of him. See, right here? And there's blood on his sword and stuff. So, this is not something that you had in a lot of previous Final Fantasies, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go on here. Part of the reason that Versus 13 was what it was because at the time, I guess, and I'm going to be getting a little bit into imagining the specifics of internal politics and decision-making with the, am I going to have to age restrict this video? I don't think I have to age restrict the video. I think that's probably fine if I don't age restrict it. The kid can get blood spilled on him in the background. There, you see he's got all the blood on him. It doesn't matter. With Versus 13, they always discussed it in terms of, it's too weird, it's too action-focused, and it's too violent to be a mainline entry in the series. And then when it became Final Fantasy 15, they took out a bunch of stuff. There were specific interviews where Tabata talked about they took out references to Reaper worship, because apparently in some countries worshiping gods of death or whatever else can bump you up to an M rating. All of the soldiers that were previously humans that spilled blood when Noctis drove the swords through them turned into robots. It's very clear they wanted to bump the game down to a T rating, though that decision making was almost 10 years removed from the actual planning phase and announcement of Versus 13. So it might have had less to do with how they wanted the brand of Final Fantasy to look at that point in time, and more to do with just raw money, because the game had been in development for so long, it had cost so much to make, that they just needed to move as many units as possible. So they wanted to get as wide of an audience as possible, so you got to aim for a T rating instead of an M rating. With this game, they don't seem to care about that as much this time around, so we can probably throw out the brand concerns at this point, and clearly they feel that they're in a better place financially, maybe as a company, or just with the cost of producing this particular game, that they don't feel that they're going to be putting themselves in danger by limiting the number of people who can purchase the game. Though, of course, the series has been playing with a lot of its arbitrary rules over the last couple of entries anyway, messing with series paradigms and traditions and whatnot. But we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. The first thing that I kind of want to say about this trailer is a weird take that I've seen about it. Two weird takes, honestly, that are both at opposite ends of the spectrum. One of the takes is, oh man, I can't believe Square's already putting spoilers in the first trailer for the game. And it's like, we don't know anything about this game yet. I mean, unless you have do you have an early copy? Did you get a leaked copy of this game? Because if so, you have to tell me and send a ROM. It's extremely important. But realistically, looking at this project, we don't know anything about this. Everything that we see in this trailer could happen in the first 20 minutes of the game. We don't know anything this is all probably the inciting incident. I mean, it could be we could be seeing stuff from the ending of the game. I don't know. The only way you can tell if something is a spoiler in a trailer is if you're familiar enough with the material to be able to make those calls. Like with Kingdom Hearts 3, when one of the last trailers showed all of the characters on the Keyblade graveyard getting attacked by a giant swarm of Heartless, it was reasonable to assume that probably happened towards the end of the game, based on our understanding of, the structure of Kingdom Hearts video games, and also based on what we'd seen in, the 10 other previous trailers. But even then, it didn't necessarily have to be at the ending. Who knows? Maybe they were all going to take a trip to the Keyblade Graveyard in the first 2 hours and try and beat Xehanort, and then things didn't go very well. So we never know. We can only ever make guesses. And with this, any guess is useless. We don't know anything about this material yet. So let's calm down with that take, first of all. And then the other take, on the other end of the spectrum, not showing too much, but showing too little, of looking at this and going, I have no idea what this is. They didn't show anything about the story. I can't get excited for this because there's no information, which is really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. And it shows how the series has kind of gotten... I shouldn't say that the series has gotten wacky in recent years. I should say that it shows... how the perception of the series has changed and how the series has presented itself has kind of changed over time. Because, we got to think about how major Final Fantasy games have been revealed in the past, and consider that this is the first time in a while that we've gotten the reveal of the next major Final Fantasy game in a relatively timely manner, especially if we factor in Final Fantasy VII Remake as a major Final Fantasy title, which I honestly assumed, and I think a lot of people assumed, that this game wouldn't happen specifically because Final Fantasy VII Remake was going to be the major big budget Final Fantasy product, for the next several years until they get that finished up. But, clearly, obviously, we've got Creative Division or Creative Unit 3 or whatever it's called, the Yoshi P team, working on this, so they've been able to divide up their resources well enough that they can get this done. But it's just... if we actually think about how the Final Fantasy series has operated for the last kind of lengthy stretch of time, it has not always been this way. Now, I can't sit here and claim to be nostalgic for the time when Final Fantasies came out every other year or whatever, because I didn't really get into video games super seriously until the late 2000s, and I didn't get into Final Fantasy at all until the late 2000s. I was one of the people, my introduction to Final Fantasy, other than, hearing the name and seeing bits and pieces of it, was really seeing, the early Final Fantasy 13 trailers. But historically speaking, the Final Fantasy series released games relatively routinely, especially in the PlayStation era. Not only did you have big games coming out pretty frequently, you had Final Fantasy VII in 1997, Final Fantasy VIII in 1999, Final Fantasy IX in 2000, and Final Fantasy X in 2000. Things were moving pretty quick. This is also just a consequence of just how game development has changed over time. Obviously, this isn't a Square Enix thing specifically. Well, not yet, anyway. It was easier to make games back in the day, is what I'm getting at here. At the time, when Final Fantasy XII took, 5 years or whatever to come out, I want to say, I think it released in 2006 in the States, but I want to say it was 2005 in Japan. I could be wrong about that. I'm not going to go look it up right now. But the wait for for the Final Fantasy XII was insane at the time, that it took so long for it to come out, right? And now that seems kind of trivial in the face of people talk about, Versus 13/15 taking so very long to come out. Final Fantasy 13 really wasn't that bad. It got unveiled in 2005, 2006. And then it came out in 2009. So Final Fantasy 13 wasn't that long of a wait situation. And then Final Fantasy 15 came out in 2016. Was it 20? It came out in 2016, right? And it was when it was technically unveiled in 2013, and technically started development in 2012. There's a lot of technicalities when you talk about Square Enix and the Final Fantasy series. But I think it's important to discuss this because since there was so much space between the last several Final Fantasies, it was kind of significant that they were all pretty wild, not counting 14, of course, which was just kind of, its initial trailers were just, look, it's a fantasy MMO, But specifically, when you look at the old kind of world of Final Fantasy, the first 5 games, I'm not in any way saying that they are all the same game, but in terms of their aesthetics, they're all basically the same game. Final Fantasy VI mixes thing. People are going to get really upset at me for that, I'm sure. You got to generalities here, okay, man? And Final Fantasy VI took a lot of cues from the previous Final Fantasy games, but really updated the look a lot, made it kind of more steampunk. It had its crazy Mode 7 graphics for its opening cutscene to really impress you and whatnot. And then Final Fantasy VII, obviously, we don't even need to get into how Final Fantasy VII changed everything. But the point that I'm getting at here is that after that, though, there weren't really every single, Final Fantasy VIII was cool. Okay, the graphics are really updated. It's just kind of it's just okay, it's a slightly more modern world than Final Fantasy VII, I guess. Okay, Final Fantasy 9, it's another fantasy world with a cartoon style. Okay, got it. Final Fantasy 10. The original trailers for that were just I almost said Noctis because he had black hair in those initial trailers. Were just Titus, running around in fields. And the look of Final Fantasy X, while it has a very nice aesthetic, is not anything that was really like, slapping people in the face other than, bright colors and whatnot. Obviously, people are saying that this trailer looks really gray. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that when Final Fantasy XIII was announced, it was a girl with pink hair on a science fiction train doing Matrix anti-gravity with a machine gun and shooting stormtroopers in the face. And then Final Fantasy XV started life as Final Fantasy Versus 13, which was about a guy in a suit with a sword killing knights in armor in Tokyo, right? The point is that the last couple of entries in this series have really modified people's expectations of what Final Fantasy is supposed to look like. The only real games in the Final Fantasy series that I would say, like, on an aesthetic level, when you look at them, they just slap you in the face and make you just instantly pay attention to what this is, like on, a trailer level, are the version of Final Fantasy 15 that doesn't exist anymore, Final Fantasy 7, and Final Fantasy 13. It's pretty normal for a Final Fantasy game to just be announced and not, like, it'd be, okay, cool, whatever, new Final Fantasy game, that's great, but not necessarily be anything that's incredibly exciting beyond the fact that the Final Fantasy brand is attached to it. It's just that it hasn't been, I shouldn't say it's that normal, it was normal 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and the whole pipeline of the production of Final Fantasy games and of Square Enix and how they've been managing the brand has been so messed up for a long time that honestly, the fact that this trailer just dropped and it's dudes with swords riding chocobos around and it's in a fantasy world, and the fact that, with this one, it's not a pre-rendered CGI trailer, it's not quite finished yet, it's all running in real time. Yoshida was talking about basically how they actually, he said it very specifically, we didn't want to do a pre-rendered thing because we didn't want to get comments of, okay, well, that'll come out in 20 years. So they made something that was, that was more of a representation of what they actually have and what the game's currently looking like. And they're talking about, this isn't finished yet. But that also indicates this has clearly been in production for a little while. There's been, I don't know the exact dates on this, but it was basically out a while ago that the team was working on some kind of single player game anyway. What's the name of the guy? What's the name of the dude? Ryota Suzuki, who is a combat designer on Devil May Cry and Dragon's Dogma, he started working for Square Enix in 2019, I think, working on some single player action game. He still isn't officially connected to this yet, but it's this is it, right? So he's been there since 2019, sometime in 2019 minimum, working on this project, which means it's, if they brought in a combat designer from another company to work on stuff, that doesn't necessarily mean that it started development before 2019. He could have even been brought in during pre-production. We don't know. But the point is that this has been in development for a little while. And hopefully we're not going to deal with a situation where, CyberConnect 2 works on it for 2 years, and then it goes back internal and half the stuff that they did gets scrapped. It's not going to be in a situation where Kingdom Hearts 3 was in development on Luminous for a year, and then all of that gets scrapped. It's not going to be a situation like Final Fantasy 13, where some people don't know about this. Final Fantasy 13 didn't have a combat system until a year before release. They couldn't agree on what they wanted it to look like, but then the Square Enix basically, I shouldn't say Square Enix as a evil entity that dictated something upon them. But basically part of the deal was to promote Advent Children Complete at the time, was the disc was going to include the demo for Final Fantasy 13. So they actually figured out and completed the combat system for that demo, which came out in the fall, November or whatever of 2008, a year before the game came out. We probably aren't dealing with a situation like that this time around. And, just hypothetically, obviously, if this comes out in a couple of years, and then 17 gets into production shortly after that, Final Fantasy VII Remake is still trucking along, coming out, let's say hypothetically every 3 years with an entry of that. I shouldn't say every, there's probably only going to be 3 of those maximum. I don't know. I don't think they would go to 4. But I guess I don't know. I don't know what the heck they're going to do with that game. The point that I'm getting at is I think that people are talking about this game, whatever. If you aren't into the character design of this man, or you don't like, knights and swords and castles in medieval times, then that's fine. That's totally cool. But my point is that the entire perspective on what a Final Fantasy reveal trailer looks like has been thrown off because there have only been like 3 Final Fantasy reveal trailers in the last 15 years. And for some people, that's that might be the entirety of their exposure to Final Fantasy in real time. It's basically mine. Now, I've gone back because I'm a nerd and I care about video game history for some reason, and I've gotten more into reading about how things were responded to at the time, things like that. So I don't want to sound like I obviously have some kind of higher perspective or whatever. That's not what I'm trying to get at. I'm just saying that I think that some of the negative reactions to this trailer, of it being unfinished, of the lighting not quite, the main thing that's really unfinished in this is not the graphics. There's a lot of like, how do I put this? Kind of lighting issues, not major or anything like that, but there's parts of this where it's clear that it's just the lighting isn't quite finished yet. It's not like completely even, video game engine lighting where there is no source, like you can tell here when you look at the side of the kid's face. There are shadows being cast. The light is coming from a direction, but it still feels kind of soupy. It doesn't feel really strong. There's not a ton of harsh light contrast here yet. The shadows in some spots could probably be darker. And you see these shadows on the characters, but a lot of stuff on like the main characters, but a lot of stuff in the background, a lot of aspects of this world. It feels like the lighting just isn't 100% there yet, which makes sense because this isn't the type of stuff that you do until later on in development. This is something that game developers talk about all the time. That's really difficult, is when you have to take games don't look finished until, the last 3 months of development, because they have to make, the game work, and then they put the other stuff in. So when developers have to make trailers like this, they have to put in a lot of work to get the game to a position where it's actually functioning, where it looks you have to put in a lot of work to just make particular aspects that they decided to show in this trailer look something close to what they envision it looking like. And of course, they say what they say. This could all still be smoke and mirrors. I remember at the time they talked about the Final Fantasy 15 trailer and gameplay sequence that we got at E3 2013. They talked about it being in a prototype engine called Ebony. What's a prototype engine? Is it called Visual Works? If you have a prototype engine, why are you making another engine? You use fake. We know. Anyway, but I don't know, who we'll never know. We'll never know what the hell happened with that game. They'll never talk about it. It's maybe when Tetsuya Nomura is 90 years old and he doesn't care anymore. It's like, sue me, who cares? Maybe he'll do an interview for a book or something. That's the only way we're ever going to find out everything. So I don't know. When I look at this trailer and think about this game, I'm not even so much thinking about the content of the trailer, but of the context, because in many ways, the Final Fantasy franchise has not been what it was for a very long time. Final Fantasy 15 had to be this comeback game where they were trying to prove themselves again and get mainstream gamers, in on it or whatever. Final Fantasy 13 obviously sold quite well, but it had mixed reception from a lot of actual players out there. It's kind of seen as this weirdo thing. I'm not really sure that it grabbed the mainstream attention that they were hoping to get when, it became a multi-platform release and it was on Xbox 360 and all that kind of stuff. Whereas now, they're in a position where, okay, sure, people were also, a lot of, especially hardcore fans, were very lukewarm on Final Fantasy 15. But generally speaking, you have a lot of members of just the broad video game gamer man audience who bought Final Fantasy 15 and probably didn't even beat it, but they drove around in the car for a while and they hung out with Noctis and friends and they had a good time. They probably didn't even get to chapter 13, but they're like, okay, sure, I'm into Final Fantasy now, I'll try stuff. They probably tried out FF7 Remake, and I don't need to get into a whole thing about Final Fantasy 7 Remake. People have freaked out so much about Final Fantasy 7 Remake, like ruining things for people or whatever, and it's like, I don't know. They didn't George Lucas it, is the main thing to me. So the special editions of Star Wars are a problem because George Lucas made it impossible to acquire the normal versions of the movies legally. No one would care about extra CGI things shoved into the original Star Wars and extra scenes and him messing with the audio mixing and weird editing of Han Solo's head to dodge bullets. Nobody would care about that, and we would all be like, oh, look, cool extra CGI shot, cool extra things here, very neat. It would be a cool novelty if we could still purchase the original, but we can't because George Lucas is an asshole. But with Final Fantasy, they've actually been quite good, better than Nintendo at least, at making their retro library not only playable, but in some cases enhanced. Like they went pretty hard on improving the that Final Fantasy VIII port, which I haven't played. I say improving, maybe I'm gonna get comments about how they actually ruined it, and I don't know, who knows, whatever. But the point is that these things are accessible, right? It's not like you cannot acquire Final Fantasy VII anymore. You can play the original PS1 version unmodified without even the graphics bumped up, where everyone is Lego people with our eyeballs misaligned. On PS3, you can go and buy the PS1 Classics version of it, right? And then on pretty much every other console currently in existence, PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC, you can go and play the 1080p version, where the graphics look the way that they were supposed to, and you have a couple of extra goodies thrown in there, like the cheats and stuff. But if you don't use the cheats, the game essentially functions the way that, it originally did. And honestly, I think that was part of the gambit with Final Fantasy VII Remake, was to position this in such a way that people are going to want to go out and buy the original and play it and get caught up, It's like when you watch a really cool movie or watching a cool TV show or whatever, and it's based on a series of books. And, you're watching, or people who watch Game of Thrones, or people who were into certain anime or whatever, right? And they're really into the show and they don't want to wait for the next season, so they go and read the source material. And I think a bunch of people did that with Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't think that it would be, the changes that are made in FF7 Remake would be problematic if this was supposed to be. It wouldn't even be problematic. They would be devastating, if this was the only version of Final Fantasy VII that exists. But it isn't. And they've even said in interviews, we hope people go back and play the original while they're waiting for the next one. So it's like, to me, I don't know. I think I see what they're going for in general, and I don't really have that many problems. But we don't need to get into a whole thing with Final Fantasy VII Remake right now. I loved it, by the way. Final Fantasy VII Remake is my game of the year 2020. Don't at me. One thing I should say is, if I ever do more videos like this, looking at trailers or discussing this type of thing, I don't know if it'll be here or not. I don't know if it'll be on Frustrated Jacob. Like I would in my head, I would do something like what we're doing right now as a live stream over on our second channel, Research Runs, where we do Let's Play videos and other things of different variety. And hypothetically, videos like the one that we're doing right now. But currently, I can't live stream anyway because I've had problems with the internet at my house for the last 5 months at this point, and I can't stream, and no one will come to fix it. And I don't mind doing, if I do start doing videos of the style that we're doing right now, I don't mind doing the first one here, and letting people know that we might do more of this over on the other channel. Just hypothetically, may or may not, I don't know. Just if we do more like this, it probably won't be here. But anyway, enough prelude. Ha 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 ha. You guys probably want to hear me talk about the content of the trailer. For me, the big picture stuff is almost always more interesting, which is why I talked about it first. But we can get into some details here about why certain things in this trailer are interesting to me. With regards to the big picture, it's looking at this game, this feels to me like a transition out of this period where they were kind of constantly in, the brand was always in at least some form of trouble, right? We don't know yet, obviously. There could be trouble in paradise with this game. Everyone is so happy because, Naoki Yoshida is working on this and, he saved Final Fantasy XIV or whatever. That doesn't mean things couldn't still go, catastrophically wrong with this game. Things happen. But just thinking historically about this series, it's like, in terms of the last several entries, Final Fantasy 12 had a director change midway through and took a long time to come out. It had a bunch of problems throughout development. I still love Final Fantasy 12, but, it's people don't agree with me. It's okay. They can be wrong. It's no big deal. But the Final Fantasy 13, they had the engine problems. Things really didn't function right for a pretty lengthy period of it. And just the vision was just kind of a bit muddled with 13. I think is really the best way to say it. I know people really like that game, and that's totally fine. But it's just clearly that there was they didn't, whatever they wanted to accomplish with that game never quite crystallized. I really feel like Final Fantasy 13-2 in many ways Final Fantasy 13-2 is the superior game in most ways, and I haven't even seen as much of Final Fantasy 13-2 as I have of Final Fantasy 13, because I didn't play either of them, but I've watched a playthrough of 13, and I've watched I didn't even have to watch enough, like all of 13-2 to just immediately like it like 100 times more. I don't know, I like Noel and Sarah way more than the entire cast of Final Fantasy 13. Yes, and then the Man on Fire from Metal Gear Solid 5 shows up. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to get at is that I think it's interesting that we're in a position where the last several games in the series have had some kind of major hiccups along the way, and we're in a position where at least potentially this one might not have any major problems. 15 had problems before it existed, before it was 15, right? And obviously we didn't know that 13 was having problems until really, there's some hints along the way, but really it was until afterwards that we really got a clear picture of exactly how, weird things had gone in the production of that game. There is the potential here for the first time in basically 20 years, and I didn't even mention Final Fantasy 14, being a complete disaster. Outside of the expansion packs for Final Fantasy 14, this game has the potential to be the first major Final Fantasy product that is not marred by crippling production issues in 20 years. Final Fantasy VII Remake, having mostly gotten over its problems, the CyberConnect situation, it sounds like was bad, that they, sacrificed a couple of years of work to those guys. But that was... Consider that was basically the best situation that's happened with any of these games in 20 years, and it really doesn't paint a very positive picture. So the mere idea that this one might come through and be able to execute on some kind of vision and have relatively few problems along the way is like, that's enough for me to be at least generally interested. Because really, even the lamer Final Fantasy games aren't that lame, like the ones that had problems. I just said that I love Final Fantasy 12. Final Fantasy 15 had problems, but it wasn't like, the worst game ever. It was totally fine. I know some people hate that game. I still think Final Fantasy 15 was okay. I don't love it, but it was fun. It was fun while it lasted. Maybe it didn't live up to the brand name or whatever, but it's better than a lot of other video games that are out there, so, whatever. And Final Fantasy 13, though I have my problems with it, I also have a lot of respect for certain aspects of it. The soundtrack of all of the 13 games is all incredible. My ringtone for the last, 10 years or whatever has been Blinded by Light, the battle theme for Final Fantasy 13. I hate Final Fantasy 13, and yet I have the battle theme as my ringtone because I have brain problems, I guess. I just think it's interesting. If this thing comes through on the other end relatively unmarred, that's news. But anyway, in terms of the actual content, I'm not going to get into too much plot speculation. Obviously, this is a world where Summoner is not a class. Certain people are bound to these ancient beings, the icons or whatever. This kid's clearly the dominant of Phoenix, but they're keeping it some kind of secret. They tell him stay inside, don't go outdoors, don't be telling people about your Phoenix powers. This guy's some kind of knight. He's in charge of protecting the kid. Whatever. Then later on, people show up and attack the castle. Blood gets tossed all over the kid. Let's check this out. Let's go, baby. Come on. Swing! It's very nice here, too. There's a lot of good editing stuff going on in this anyway. But you'll watch here. I imagine in the action, because this shot's very short, I imagine in the full version of the game, this might go on a few more frames, but I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's just, it's just edited really tightly. You don't see, I don't know, there's good editing and good cinematography on display in this game, which is, you don't always get. Like Final Fantasy VII Remake has some of the liveliest, best edited, best animation performanced scenes I've seen in a Square Enix game in a long time, and it still feels really slow and lethargic in a lot of scenes. So just looking at the action going on here, with the detail on the facial animation, the speed of the cuts, it's very well done. This shot could be slightly longer, if you wanted it to be, but it's clear enough visually what's going on with this light here, making sure that these guys can be really clearly seen against this dark background. It's clear enough what's happening because the motion is very deliberate. There's really nothing moving in the frame all that much except for the sword. That you can track it with your eyes really easily, and the cut's very clean. It cuts on the motion, so that type of... People, this is not what they want to hear me talking about in a trailer for Final Fantasy 16. I don't care, because it's what I'm going to talk about. It's well cut, dude. This is well edited. I like this kind of stuff. It's well put together. But there's good stuff going on here with basically, you don't see it, when you're watching it live, but you'll look at the kid's clothes here, and before we actually see any blood spill out of this guy, blood starts to pool on his clothes and then onto his face, and only here do we see actually blood leaving the body, right? But what's nice is that it comes down here into frame over Joshua, over the kid, as the effects really get intense on him, right? So there isn't actually any blood being animated flying over and hitting Joshua. You just have this stuff coming down over him within the frame, kind of masking that transition. But even though it technically starts before we see the blood get to him, visually, since the cut, this is the type of stuff that, people will, this is, cinema sins, ding, whatever stuff, where it doesn't make sense logically when you track it on a frame-by-frame basis sometimes, but this is the kind of stuff you have to do to get the audience to really, this kind of stuff you have to do to trick the audience sometimes, and this is very well done here, because you have this stuff fading in on him, so you get the impression of what's happening, and then it blends in with this stuff as it comes down into frame. And that makes it feel more like he is being sprayed by something by having these droplets hit him, like a bit is flung out at him. And then these two frames right here, where he's really starting to get covered up in blood on his collar, are way too fast for the eye to register the intensity before they get covered up by the huge blood spurt, right? So if we watch that back, it's very well done. There's other bits in here that are slightly more obvious editing tricks, just stuff that you should always do. In terms of cutting on, there's a lot of cutting on action that's very appreciated, cutting on movement. There's a lot of, there's also some stuff where, and this may seem really, really obvious, especially if you're a film person, but you just don't, sometimes you don't see video games do this stuff outside of like Naughty Dog games. But even Naughty Dog games, often their editing isn't that intense. They tend to have kind of flatter filming and slower editing. But here we have this shot of this boulder coming in and crushing this unfortunate man. What's nice is we have the boulder maintaining its position here on one side of the frame. I guess I should use the mouse, not my hands. Tracking in towards him, right? And in just the last couple of frames, his face gets, just even the last frame, his face comes completely into focus here, right? And they're really like kind of almost contorting the way that his body is, like the way that his arm is coming up here and touching against the boulder, right? It looks a little bit cartoonish almost, but because it only lasts for like a frame, it just reads really clearly to the eye, where we get to register very clearly that there is a expression of terror on this guy's face. And then obviously here, the boulder's touching his shoulder, right? But in the next shot, boulder's all the way up here. And we have to watch it come down and hit him. But this is just something that you do in editing, where you show action twice between cuts to make it seem more impactful. So the action can still happen really fast, but the audience can keep up with exactly what's happening. And then also we have, when it hits him, he goes behind a rock, so we don't actually have to animate that, and we have the camera jerk up very suddenly, impact of the boulder hitting the ground, shaking, and then just a little bit, it's very dark, just a little bit of gore, just a little bit of blood splashing up, mixed with some pebbles, just the scantest implication of what's happening. Clearly there's going to be some kind of attack on the castle. Kid's going to get blood splashed all over him. That's big trauma. He doesn't like that very much. And then he gets very upset and summons a phoenix. People have pulled up the Japanese version of the trailer, which has slightly different VO. That's another thing people have freaked out about, is that this trailer is mistranslated from scenes that they haven't seen the entirety of. There's a scene where seemingly, seemingly, this guy says that refers to Joshua as his brother. The fact of the matter is that if this is, if they've been producing stuff, if this game is functioning in some state, they might have bothered to go ahead and do these complete scenes, and the scenes might have just been translated in their entirety and then they just picked the parts that they wanted to voice and then, you know, edit for this trailer, right? So I don't like, it's, people are freaking out about like the dialogue being so different between trailers, but it may be that, you know, you know, if you were watching the full scene, you'd have context so certain lines function differently. You know, I'm really not too concerned. People are like saying that this is a bad translation before we've even like seen the rest of the game. Whatever. Anyway. Oh no, there's another fire guy? That's impossible. So I guess they believe that there's only one summon per element, I suppose. But whatever. Ifrit is here, clearly working for the bad guys in some way. He's here to whack all of the guys living in this castle, including the kid with the phoenix. Maybe they knew that the kid was here and they were trying, or rather they knew that someone with a phoenix was here and they were trying to lure him out. Also, I don't know if this is, in terms of like, because people have been complaining about like the aesthetics of this look too low-key. It's just like a normal castle from what we've seen. Number one, come on guys, it's one trailer. We see 2 locations in this. Well, I guess we see a swamp. Relax. But we can see in the background of this shot, what the heck is that? Now, what is all of that? Is that this castle at the beginning of the game, or are we playing tricks and pulling footage of a Phoenix fight from later in the game at some kind of more fantastical setting? Or when we're down on the grounds of that castle and the rest of this, are we actually in this castle the whole time? Are we in this Insano World castle, right? We don't know. I want to say there's one wide of this starting castle. That tower goes kind of high, but it doesn't look like it's high enough to be one of those big fantasy towers, and we didn't really see... We can see a starry night nearby and no big towers nearby. Let's have a look here. Yeah, okay, see, these are normal towers. No, that fantasy tower is, that's somewhere else in the game. That fantasy tower is from some other later point in the game that they aren't sharing with us right now, I'm sure. Anyway, who knows? In the scene where somebody's getting ripped up by Ifrit right here, where the guy screams about Joshua waking up, in the Japanese version, the guy says, "Stop, that's my brother," or something like that. I don't know how, like, so maybe, you know, maybe Joshua's gonna die or whatever, right? Who cares? Really, what I'm saying is, if this guy is ripping up an individual person, that doesn't really make sense. Look how big his hands are, right? Like, the way that he's grabbing and tearing, to me, would suggest, like the way that the pressure he's exerting, yeah, right? That to me says ripping off limbs, right? You know, ripping a leg off or an arm off or whatever. Very, very grim. But this guy's huge. Number one, I don't think that his fingers are quite precise enough to grab a human limb. And beyond that, he wouldn't have to exert that kind of force because he would just pick a person up, wouldn't he? He's huge. Look at the size of that lad. He's big. He's so big. How's he gonna pick up one guy when he's that big? Or, I mean, how is he not going to pick up one guy? So here's the fantasy towers again in the background. How is he gonna rip off limbs? So I would think maybe what we're actually seeing there, where he's ripping something up, and the guy's screaming for Joshua to wake up, is he's not actually ripping apart a human, as this shot and the dialogue would perhaps suggest to us. He's probably actually ripping up Phoenix. He's probably beating the crap out of Phoenix in that fight in the smaller castle, because probably Joshua's never turned into Phoenix before and doesn't know what the hell he's doing. We got this blue glow here. These nice blue kind of peacock-looking things down here at the bottom. Very nice. These are both good designs. I like these designs. I've heard people say that this is like just FF14 Ifrit. I haven't played FF14, so I wouldn't know. I mean, if they're recycling assets, you know, whatever. Good for them. Get the game out faster. That's all. Get the game out faster. Who cares? Who can't recycle the assets? Get the game out faster. Anyway, our big boy here, I think he beats up Phoenix. And who knows? We don't know how summoning is going to work in this. Maybe the dominance, you know, if the summon gets killed, maybe they get killed, you know? So maybe Joshua is going to die here. Who knows? The reason people are talking about Joshua hypothetically dying is because of the abilities we see our boy has, our protagonist Kun, whose name we still do not know. Because we see when he's doing his very DMC5 strings, or DMC in general, I shouldn't say DMC5. DMC3 through DMC5. There wasn't really a lot like this in DMC1 and DMC2, obviously, we shall not speak of. But It makes me think specifically of it makes me think of some specific moves from 5. But you see here, he does some kind of punch, he does an uppercut, and it causes a big phoenix wing to appear, right? I'm sure most of you probably already noticed this kind of stuff, keyed into it. It's pretty obvious, it's hard to miss. He does this a couple of times in the trailer. So now that could be an ability that he has because he's Joshua's protectorate, right? Or not his protectorate, his protector. Maybe Joshua, people who are dominants, who have control of summons, they can grant a portion of their power to an individual. For example, we see back here, does some kind of glowy thing to somebody. Oh yeah, see, yeah, red gloves. It's our boy. He does some kind of glowy phoenix something or other. Gives him some kind of juice. Gave him the summon juice. So maybe that gives him some kind of Phoenix-themed abilities, right? He was lent a portion of the Phoenix's power, right? Because this is happening here during this fight in the castle that I presume takes place before Joshua goes nuts, activates Phoenix, whatever, right? So he can't have, but some people are talking about if Joshua does die, I don't have a name for him, protagonist, maybe he inherits the Phoenix, right? And we see him here. Maybe he's older, he's got full-on Phoenix powers, maybe he's the dominant now. People are just making that up, they're theorizing, whatever. And it wouldn't make sense to me that he has the power to turn into the summon just because he has the Phoenix punch, because, where is it? Is it back here? Here, immediately after he does Phoenix punches, he does Titan punches. Check this out, see? That's Titan's fist. Certainly looks like Titan's fist anyway. Now, it's entirely possible that our character is going to acquire the ability to summon a bunch of different summons, icons, whatever they're called in this game, throughout the experience, right? That could certainly happen. He could certainly go around and whack a bunch of different summoner dominants and gain their powers, all in his quest to go after and kill Ifrit. The art here, Phoenix fighting Ifrit. Going back for revenge, I'm sure. I'm sure that what we're seeing here with Ifrit is the inciting incident, some kind of attack on the castle. All of our protagonists' friends are killed, possibly Joshua. I've seen people making a big deal out of earrings, a bunch of people wearing earrings. There's only 2 earrings in the trailer as far as I can tell that are identical, and they are one Joshua has right here. See it? And the one our protagonist has, which is probably some kind of indication, right? Like it's something that it could be just something they got for fun. Maybe they just both got maybe the kid wanted to get his ears pierced and he was scared. And the guy said, I'll do it. I'll go first, show you that it's not that scary. Realistically, probably it's some kind of indication of, I'm the one who looks after this particular guy. We wear matching earrings. And then you can see at the ending of this, the adult version is still wearing that same earring. You can still spot it through his time-lapse hair, through his time skip. I'm very bitter and angry now hair. That's the other thing. People are saying this design is super generic. And I mean, I'm not going to necessarily disagree. It's a guy with black hair, but it's like, Final Fantasy 13 had a lady with pink hair. Just, standards, our perspective may be a little bit off with this Final Fantasy thing is what I'm getting at here, okay? Oh yeah, hold on. Just because I'm capable of doing this and I'm an asshole. Hey, look, check it out. Oh, cool, we got a pet chocobo. We got our trusty steed. He's got those clear blue eyes, these beautiful white feathers. I almost said fur, but no, they're feathers. What a beautiful chocobo. I can't wait to form a lasting friendship with this chocobo over the course of the events of Final Fantasy 16. Oh no. Oh no. Is that chocobo dead? Is that our dead friend having rushed in to save us? Having rushed in and sacrificed himself to save us? Oh no. Oh no. Oh, it's so sad. Oh no. You people voted on Twitter for me to make a video about this. This is what you get. Something about this girl's laugh. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to explain it. I mean, there's plenty of naturalistic animation in video games, and even sometimes in Japanese video games. just something supernatural about that laugh. I think it's the surprise. She seems surprised that, you know, comedy is about subverting expectations. She seems surprised by whatever he said and amused. I don't know how to explain it. There's just something about that animation that's really good. Whoever worked on that, they did a good job. They just sell that very well. I don't know. I like this is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, okay? I know people want me to tell them what the plot of the game is going to be. I'm interested in the production here, okay? I suppose we might as well take a little bit of a look at the gameplay here. So we've clearly got our little, you know, our DMC Dragon's Dogma combat designer here working on this. I do wonder how a lot of these systems are going to be implemented. I'm sure we'll still have some kind of MP bar or whatever. Seems like it'd be weird to completely remove that, but who knows? Who knows? They can do whatever they want. Really, the only like Final Fantasy tradition that'd be weird if they, because for the most part, like to me, the whole appeal of Final Fantasy as a brand is specifically that they can do whatever they want. Like, I know people get really bent out of shape over what Final Fantasy is or isn't, what type of combat it should or shouldn't have. But to me, the real advantage of Final Fantasy as a brand is the ability to attach a huge budget to a weirdo idea, right? It's really hard to go out there and pitch, I want to make a game about some guy who's from a future volleyball player, and he gets sent to the post-apocalypse of a tropical world, and give me a ton of money to make this now, please. I want to make a game about 4 dudes riding around in a car and hanging out and broing out and fighting monsters. I want to make a game about whatever, right? It's hard to get somebody on board with something that's really weird. The reason that Final Fantasy is able to have its big budgets and still make weirdo games is because of the brand value, you know? It's an anthology series. The advantage here is that you can do whatever you want with any of the given games and still have the brand recognition that means you can expect a certain number of units sold, which means you can expect a certain kind of budget, you know? So to me, I really don't care that much about moving away from certain traditions or whatever, especially because back in the day, the games were made so quickly, you know? It's like, whatever, if you don't like Final Fantasy VIII all that much, you're gonna get Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X, you know, next year or whatever, right? That's changed a little bit more recently, where really the only flavors of mainline FF that we've had for a while are 13, 14, 15, and now FF7 Remake, right? Which is a rehash flavor, even if it is a particularly good flavor from my personal point of view. But, you know, if we get back to a position where the company has its footing a bit more, and they're not building a new engine every time they want to make one of these games, and the series is maybe getting a bit more back towards mainstream popularity and selling enough units, and they're keeping their budgets under control, and the games don't wind up in development hell for 10 years. You know, if they're making these a little bit more frequently, then to me, it's not that big of a deal that Final Fantasy 16 is, you know, an action game in medieval. Maybe the next game will be old school turn-based and set on the moon, you know, whatever. And we still don't even know what this is. We've barely seen any of it. They're not going to show us all the cool stuff in the first trailer. There was a specific, one of the lines somewhere that they said, I'm going to go through some quotes and stuff later. There was some specific line where Yoshi P. I don't like calling him that. Naoki Yoshida. There was some line in some interview or something. He's talked about this very, very little. It might have been when Yoko Taro brought it up on a stream that I don't think he was supposed to. It's hard to say. We'll talk about this. There was an interview they were talking about. It was one of the it was a FF14 stream at TGS. And Yoko Taro brought up Final Fantasy 16 and got Yoshi P to talk about it for a few minutes. And like under most circumstances, I would assume that was planned ahead of time, and they said, hey, at some point, you should ask a question about this, and then, you know, you'll present your very brief, pre-prepared statement on the subject, right? When Yoko Taro asks it during a panel, you know, I'm like 90% sure he's drunk anyway. It's impossible to say for sure if it was planned or not. But regardless, I believe it was during that he specifically said, we didn't really put anything in this trailer that is a major like selling point. We just wanted to show it running in real time and what it is and get it out there. And we're going to talk about it more next year. They also said they're going to put up a website in like October. They say they want to get a teaser site up in late October. I wouldn't get too excited for that, folks. It's probably going to have like a paragraph of information about the story and the characters. That's probably all going to be stuff we could have already ascertained from this trailer. But anyway, my point that I'm getting at here is that I really do think that like this is a series where I think the benefit is that the benefit of the series is that they shouldn't be too bound to structural, aesthetic, gameplay traditions, because the point is, to me, the entire appeal of the series is someone at the studio can have a weirdo idea, and if they get everybody on board with it, they can make it and have a bigger budget than they'd be able to have otherwise. That to me is the cool thing about Final Fantasy. That being said, there is one series tradition that me personally, I feel like it would be weird for them to eschew and to skip with this particular entry. And that's the party. To me, every single FF game is about an ensemble cast, like all of them universally. So having I shouldn't say no supporting characters, because obviously there are supporting characters in games with only one playable character. But having no other party members would be kind of weird. That's one thing that I feel like you can't. That's like a tradition that I wouldn't want to see them skip. Now, of course, people are freaking out because there's gameplay of this one guy. We didn't see any party member. We didn't see any characters other than Lightning in Final Fantasy 13 trailers until like trailer 3 or 4, I think. And even then, it was just like we just saw Vanille in a couple of FMVs where she was just standing there or looking at a disc that the carbuncle came out of. So like, I wouldn't, like, it's not like I'm like, because he's here on his own, I don't expect to see anything. Realistically, the problem is, and this is part of the problem that FF7 Remake is going to confront, is that when your combat isn't in menus, when you have to, design control schemes and play styles where all the characters feel distinct, that's a lot of work. It's hard to get that many people up and running, which is why FF7 Remake, the first one, only has 4 people. They didn't bother to code in Red 13 as, a playable character with his own skill tree and abilities and movesets and everything, because he's only in the game for 4 hours, if that. So, he'll be playable in the next game where it makes sense to spend the resources to, develop that. And in that same vein, especially if this is, taking off a little bit of like a DMC or whatever, if all of the characters have more unique movesets, it would be very difficult to have a roster of 17 characters where everybody, has their own movesets. Now, of course, we could just have, 3 or 4 characters, and that's a little bit easier to program. Or alternatively, we could only have one playable character, but backup characters, more like a Kingdom Hearts situation or whatever, AI helpers that we still manage in menus, but that we don't necessarily play as. Realistically, though, especially if the game, they got to get enough of the game polished to be able to show in this trailer because they wanted everything running in real time. The actual problem is they had to get this guy's combat looking good enough in terms of its animations, in terms of its effects, in terms of camera. They had to get this guy running good enough that he looked good in a trailer. They don't have, how much time it took them, how much they had to slow down development probably to get this trailer ready. They're not going to do that for another playable character. So, there are probably other members of the cast. Won't be a huge cast probably if you can play as all of them, unless they all fight the exact same way, which would be a little bit weird. They all fight the exact same way if they're all red mages fighting with swords and casting a little bit of magic here and there, and maybe only our main guy has the melee strings that incorporate summons or whatever, or maybe other characters that have other summons have melee strings that incorporate summons, whatever. Point is, you could do that. You could have there's different ways that you could manage it. But my point is more that I'm not at all surprised that we're not seeing other playable characters in this trailer. That would have been a lot of work. Even if they have other characters that they're already playable in some build somewhere, getting them ready for this trailer would have been a lot of unnecessary work. That's the thing. People are freaking out. Oh, no party, no this, no that, no female characters, blah, blah, blah. It's like, guys, it's the first trailer. Final Fantasy 13's first trailer was Lightning on a train with a gun. She walked through the woods for 5 seconds. That was the trailer. Calm down. It's one trailer. Chill out. This is not the game yet, okay? As we talked about up front with this, a little bit of blood. It is interesting to me that, like I was talking about earlier about branding and whatnot, I don't know if it's their financial security or if it's differences about their perception of their brand, but clearly they think they can do an M-rated Final Fantasy now, something that they previously felt that they couldn't do, either because it didn't fit within the brand or because it wouldn't sell enough units in the case of Final Fantasy 15, because they needed to massively recoup costs. Who knows? But this trailer, everything about it feels like we're moving Final Fantasy back towards a regular video game brand. Like, it's not Call of Duty. We're not going to get a game every year or whatever, but like, you know, we make games frequently. If, you know, I guess I shouldn't say it happens. It has happened. If it happens, if we get to a position where we're making games frequently enough that, you know, we're not waiting 5 years for the next major Final Fantasy game. If like, you know, if throughout, let's say up until like, you know, let's say that hypothetically, we don't know how long this game has been in development for, right? Let's say that the average development cycle from here on out, again, hypothetically, let's say that Creative Unit 3 or whatever they're called, Creative Business Unit 3. Let's say that these guys become the new mainline FF team, and Nomura and Kitase are off working on FF7 Remake for the next couple of years, right? Let's say that these, which, let's assume it's using Unreal, or at least an engine that the team knows how to work with and isn't being developed at the same time. Let's say that these guys take maybe 4 years per game, hypothetically, and Final Fantasy VII, considering they get to recycle a lot of assets, they get to recycle systems, let's say that each of those takes like 3 years, right? We could get in a pretty decent rhythm throughout the 2020s of, you know, alternating between FF7 Remake entry, then one of these, FF7 Remake entry, you know. And this is before we include other teams who are hypothetically developing things. Luminous is making that Project Athea or whatever that I couldn't care less about. Did I say Luminous team or tools? Luminous Productions or whatever they're called. Luminous, anything on Luminous Engine, I don't care. You want to lose my attention immediately? You want to make me not interested in your product? Tell me it's on Luminous Engine. I check out immediately. The studio of bad memories and sunk costs. Anyway, but the point is, you know, if they're in a position where they got their stuff together and, you know, the ball is rolling, they've gotten the talent into the studios, they've got the money into the studios, and the brand value is going back up, and more normies are playing Final Fantasy. People are freaking out that this looks too much like Game of Thrones or The Witcher or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, Game of Thrones, well known for its giant kaiju fights. Oh dude, look, it's just like Game of Thrones. Look, it's Game of Thrones, you guys. It's like Game of Thrones. But this is an action game, you know? Action, blood, movie, kung fu. You know, this is gonna be, I think this game could do quite well for itself if it comes out okay on the other end. This could be a bit of, you know, this could be a decent mainstream hit. If the localization is pretty good, if the cutscene production is anything resembling as good as my impression is from this, if the action is as good as DMC, but, you know, more accessible because it's not a, you know, it's not that, Final Fantasy is a weirdo game, but it's not that kind of weirdo game. You know, if this feels as good as a DMC or whatever, but it's just a little bit more accessible, maybe, you know, maybe there's a higher difficulty level that's the, you know, the May Cry like, that's the Bayonetta like, the character action, and then on the lower difficulties it's a little bit simpler. You know, who knows? I'm speaking in raw hypotheticals here. I don't know, I look at this game as the potential to be a major breakthrough hit. Final Fantasy 15 was because of its aggressive marketing. Honestly, that's one thing I've been thinking about, because I've been seeing some people throw around sales numbers comparisons between FF7 Remake and FF15. And it's like, number one, FF7 Remake is a remake of Final Fantasy 7, one of the greatest games of all time. That's the line. That's what people, Final Fantasy 7? Well, that's one of the greatest games of all time. I gotta play that. So it has that going for it. And if you think about what happened when 15 came out, I mean, the lead up to 15, the marketing money that they spent on that game was insane. It was ludicrous, the amount of money they spent marketing that. Whereas FF7 was much more restrained. I mean, obviously you still had your Butterfingers tie-ins and whatnot, you know. You gotta have you gotta have a little bit of sleaziness in there. But it's like, you know, it didn't take over the, you know, the discourse and the conventions, you know, for 2 years. It was like, oh yeah, FF7 Remake's coming out. We don't need, people know FF7's Remake coming out. Make sure they know the release date. It's out there. It's fine, you know. So I don't know. My point is that FF15 was kind of a mainstream breakthrough in a lot of ways, but you know, and people enjoyed it, and I think it got people to say, okay, cool, I guess I like Final Fantasy now. But I think this game, even more so, has the potential to, if it's executed well, if it's got combat that is half as good as it looks, if this game is executed well, if it has a clear vision, a good story, it's well made, it's got just enough anime to be fun. You know, we got kaiju, and people, oh, it looks so dull. The guy's doing combos where he's throwing freaking, you know, firebird wings and giant floating fists at people. There's a dragoon that's going to show up in, if this is, if this is the intro of the game, this, attack on the castle, if this happens in the first couple of hours or whatever, we're going to have a fight against a dragoon pretty early on. They held off Aranea for like 10 hours, for crying out loud, or whatever, This game's got enough anime going on. Look, the logo's kaiju fighting each other, right? Look at this big, fat, ugly goblin. Where was he? There he was. Star Wars monster-looking ass. Look at that. Look at that guy. Look at that guy. This game's gonna be plenty weird, you guys. Calm down. I think it's gonna have just enough weird... I shouldn't say I think. I don't know, obviously. I don't know anything. Though these big evil towers in the background. These big crystalline castle towers. Tells me something weird's gonna happen eventually, at least. But, I don't know. I just... My thought is that everything that I see with this, if this game comes through well on the other end, if the gameplay really holds up, if it's marketed decently, if it's well-directed, if it's well-written, if it's exciting and weird enough, this has the potential to really... The point is that the Final Fantasy brand in general, they're really doing a good job of kind of turning it around right now. FF7 Remake was pretty well-received. FF15 was pretty well-received. If they can just kind of keep the rhythm up for a while, I feel like we could kind of be back to where this whole thing was, 20 years ago in some ways. Maybe not quite the way that it was 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, FF7 was, rewriting the book on what video games could look like and how video games could be sold. So perhaps we won't get to that point, but, I really feel like this could get back to some kind of... I feel like the brand could get back to some kind of more favorable position, and I feel like FF15 was a starting point that stumbled a little bit. I feel like FF7 was the surefire bet that accomplished what it needed to accomplish. This thing might have the breakthrough potential to really do some brand building and get people back in. I don't know. I think there's a lot. I think just from what I'm seeing here, I think there's a lot of smart decisions being made. But who knows? Game could still be terrible. That's the main thing. I saw some people saying I wouldn't talk about this because I made that video called "I'm so tired of being excited," that I just don't I'm not sure what people thought. Some people misinterpreted that video. It's just that I don't like the marketing cycles of spending 6 years waiting for something. It's like, how do I put this? For the most part, movies, we don't see a trailer. We don't see a trailer for a movie until it's been shot. With video games, sometimes we see a trailer before it's in production. It's just annoying. You can't burn out your audience. You can't burn out your client's goodwill with your product by taking forever to release something, by the constant teasing and the... people get worn out. They spend too much time getting excited for stuff, It just happens. It's just how the human psyche is built. And if they don't get worn out, then they just keep getting more and more excited. And they wind up having the product ruined for them. Which is why this isn't anything new. I've known this for a while. L.A. Noire was my experience, where that game is amazing, but the first time I played it, I was really let down by it. And I think it was because it was because I got myself too excited for it. It wasn't until I kind of went back to it a few years later that I was like, oh, wait, hold on, this game is awesome. Why didn't I see this before? Oh, because I was expecting it to be the greatest thing I'd ever played. I haven't really allowed myself to get excited for anything since then. I think the only real exception was I got excited for Spider-Man Far From Home and Spider-Man PS4. I don't know why. It snuck up on me. And Spider-Man PS4 mostly satisfied me, and Far From Home definitely satisfied me. I got what I wanted out of that movie. It wasn't like it was the greatest movie ever made or whatever, but I got excited for what a Marvel movie can be, and I got everything that I wanted out of it. But anyway. So I like Final Fantasy 15 even didn't really disappoint me because I was always managing my expectations for that. Even in like early videos where I did analysis for that, I was like, there's some video where I specifically said the phrase, don't get overhyped, don't rush out and pre-order the game, like manage your expectations, which I always try to do. Final Fantasy 15 didn't disappoint me because I kept my expectations low, which is where expectations are best kept, in my personal opinion. So I don't mind talking about stuff. And I wouldn't say that I'm excited for this yet because, we still don't know what it is. It could still be anything. Be a piece of crap. But there's just a lot of interesting decisions on display here, that's all. But looking at individual, like, moves and inputs here is interesting to me. We got some kind of dodge backwards here, which is different from the other dodges that we've seen, because we've seen him do kind of more normal evades. Here he leaves behind some kind of shadow clone, right? Which might be kind of the version of, your Souls-likes in other games. They have multiple dodges. They have the one that's the you press, another that you double tap. So maybe instead of the double tap being a roll, the double tap is leave behind your little clone and duck out of the way, right? There's still a hit spark on it, it looks like. Like it's still registered, or maybe that happens before the hit. Is it an explosive that hurts him? No, it doesn't look like it. Whatever. Anyway, he dodges out of here, and then he has an immediate, when you hit melee out of that, he has an immediate follow-up where he jumps back to his original position, because the game's assuming, if you ducked out from that spot, you're going to want to go back to that spot because you were dodging an enemy attack from a guy who was right there, right? But there's a lot of stuff going on here that's very nice, and this is some other action games, and Final Fantasy 15 didn't really get this, but FF7 really executed on this well. I like the combat of FF7 a lot, but just its sense of impact. This game is a little bit more restrained in terms of the particle effects than FF7, but you can see here we get a lot of frames where our animation is completely frozen, camera shake to really sell it. Then the sword jumps all the way through with the hit sparks. And then the follow-through animation. We also get right here, very dynamic, hand thrown out, fireball. Now, that could be part of the finisher, that could be part of this animation where it's like, pre-canned of if you fire, what am I saying? Where it looks like, it could be just part of this move. Every time that you jump forward and do this move, you always follow up with a fireball to launch them away from you. But more likely, I would guess that there's an ability in the game where you press a button to cast a spell of some kind immediately after doing that move, and then that, if you cast it successfully and you have MP, then it does a little extra damage and forces them away from you, and then you can follow up with another melee string, right? Got a little air juggling going on there. Follow up with a fireball, explosion to do your big damage. Presumably big damage. We obviously don't have a health bar. No, I don't care about you. Go away. We already looked at this guy a little bit before. But we can see a bunch of seemingly discrete actions here. So we've got a dodge right here. He dodges out of the way of this tentacle, which looks like he doesn't leave behind a shadow clone, but it did have kind of he had like an initial slight dodge right here, right? Then another dodge where the camera does this, and he really kind of warps over, and we see a little bit of that black kind of swirling effect around him, which may be from the Malboro, but it looks kind of similar to what happened when he did the shadow clone a minute ago. So I don't know, maybe just the dodge looks like that. Who knows? So we got a dodge, we have a fire cast, we have a fire elemental forward dash, into a hit, which probably happens automatically, into an air dodge, and then presumably another hit following up on that, right? Now, it's possible that this is another form of, kind of distance closer, similar to, this might not be a move you can perform anytime, this dash forward. This might have to do with similar to the attack we saw a second ago where he dashed forward and then jumped forward again. Maybe this is specifically something you can do only immediately after a backwards dash. Maybe if you cast a fire spell, maybe before he dashed back and then hit melee and leapt forward. Maybe here, if you dash back and cast a fire spell, then leap forward, then you leap forward with an elemental effect. But he also does a full-on teleport, I think, doesn't he? Doesn't the model the model disappears and relocates over here, which is different than what he did before. So who knows? And there's just a lot of moveset customization. You can slot in different abilities and whatnot. Who knows? Who cares? Not me. So here we see the same move from before. He leaves behind the shadow clone. Foomp. Immediate follow-up where he launches towards the enemy and slashes them. More of a normal string getting hit. This bit's interesting. Seemingly got some kind of magic tether attached to this goblin boy here, which he jerks down Looks like it might have some kind of electric effect and it stuns him. Or that might just be Final Fantasy particle effects. Like I said, some of the particle effects in this are slightly more subdued than FF7 Remake, he says, as this happens. But they are. There's a little bit less going on with some of the effects here. Not all of them. Some of them are pretty extreme, but FF7, there's a lot of moves that they really like, those particle effects flying everywhere, which isn't bad. It looks good. Just different tone, slightly more restrained, I guess, in spots. But this is all these effects are really selling the moves. It's very well done, honestly. It's very well animated. We got a nice sense of impact on these attacks. There's a lot of really good work happening with the camera. This is one of the main areas where Kingdom Hearts' combat has started to feel really sloppy. In like Kingdom Hearts 2, it made up for it largely because of the like really solid animation work and really solid sound design of when you have hitting things in that game. The way that enemies reacted with animation, the way that the actual moves looked. The later Kingdom Hearts games, they don't really have the really good animations on the actual attacks. They don't really have the sound design isn't even quite as good. And when they lack that slowdown and that really nice camera manipulation where you have a little bit of jostle or zoom or whatever else that you need to sell those hits. It's part of why Kingdom Hearts feels so limp. It's because they just haven't really implemented stuff like that at all. They used to get by on the strength of their animations and the just raw game feel, and Kingdom Hearts doesn't really have those two things anymore. Still fun. I don't want to sound like I'm just bringing up Kingdom Hearts to have an excuse to, you know, make fun of it. Despite my feelings on those games, on some of those games. I still don't think there's a single bad entry in the entire Kingdom Hearts series, except maybe like Union Cross or whatever, but it's a slave to its bad genre, you know? Gacha games aren't my thing in the first place. But like DDD, even though I'm on the record, I don't really like Dream Drop Distance. I don't think it's a bad game, I just don't like the narrative of it, and I have some problems with the game design, but it's still fun. Kingdom Hearts 3, also fun. Could be better. Doesn't mean it's unfun. Played plenty of games that are worse than those two. Got our Titan Fists here again, like I was talking about earlier, and our Phoenix combos. The lighting here also really sells it. The way that when this thing comes in, it casts this kind of glow. A little bit less on the follow-up ones, but on the hit, you get this big flash of light. You get the slowdown. It's just solid animation work here. Now, you know, who knows how much of this is going to be in the game. These camera angles are so close up right here that this doesn't feel like it's conventional gameplay. That almost feels like it's a finishing move, right? Like he's down at critical health and you hit the finish him button. That almost doesn't feel like it's just conventional gameplay. That feels like that's the end of a boss fight. Because even when we saw the Titan Fists coming out during the, where was it? The goblin we were grappling with. I see, well, maybe those are those Titan Fists? That could be another summon altogether. Those don't look like Titan Fists. That could be something else. Who knows what that is? That could be anything. Who knows? I wonder if there will be kaiju gameplay. You'll get to play as the Phoenix or whatever for a final boss fight or something like that. There's the man on fire from Metal Gear Solid again. Even the way that like the camera zoom and the eye flash, like the blur, the zoom in, the eye flash, that looks like MGS5 cinematography. It's so dead on. Final Fantasy 16, subtitle Fighting Fire with Fire. Ifrit versus the Phoenix. But who will be the Phoenix King? Or I guess the Phoenix Duke in this case. Yeah, I don't know, dude. All this stuff is just interesting to me. From an optics standpoint of, you know, series planning, brand. The content's also interesting enough, of course, but I don't know enough about the game yet to get super duper interested about the actual content. You know, this one hopefully won't get mired, because the problem is a lot of more recent Final Fantasy games that came out, you know, they may have had some really good, that had problems. Maybe they had some really good ideas and they just didn't get executed upon, you know? This one is being run by a guy who, produced by a guy who, you know, track record indicates he knows what he's doing. The director, what's the director's name? Hold on. Hiroshi Takai, who many people hadn't heard of before this kicked off, myself included, directed The Last Remnant, which I don't know anything about. More pressingly, I think he directed, or like was a co-director on a couple of the Final Fantasy XIV, expansions. I think he's specific, like he wasn't credited on Shadowbringers, probably because they were doing this, which also is a good indication of the timeline on this whole thing, probably because... Yeah, June 2017. We can probably, based on what little we know about the staff of this game so far, I don't think it's unreasonable to guess that this game probably started development sometime after, shortly after the development of that game. And it's definitely been in development since this, I would assume. It's been in development for at least a year, probably, minimum. Jason Schreier or somebody, I think it was Jason Schreier, and usually he's a pretty good source of information on this type of stuff. I think he was saying the game's been in development for like 3 years or something like that already, 3 or 4 years. So, that probably includes pre-production though. So, who knows? We'll see. We don't know how far along the game is, and I don't want to waste too much time theorizing about that sort of stuff. We don't have enough information. I feel like 2022 is probably the reasonable, time slot, but I guess we'll see. Who knows? Could take longer. Maybe this is farther along than we think it is, and it'll be sooner. Who knows? Well, hold on a second. Now I got, This is just Guy on Twitter, but I was bookmarking some things that I was looking through earlier. Now I got Guy on Twitter who says that the folks who made Heaven's Sword, which came out in, 2015, I want to say. Yeah. Got Guy on Twitter, uncorroborated, saying that the Heaven's Sword staff, which came out in 2015, left to go work on this. That feels like a while ago. It's 5 years ago? If that was the case, then either they had a long pre-production cycle or, the game's going to come out if it came out that long ago, I think I'd actually be a little bit more worried, unless it's coming out, next year. But I guess we'll see. Who knows? We'll find out. Who knows? That's just Guy on Twitter. One thing I do want to look at really quickly is this bit from that 14 panel that I mentioned earlier. This is subtitles done by RPG Moogle, who does... I guess I shouldn't say he does good work because I don't speak Japanese, so he could be making all of this up, but who knows? Anyway.
今日でも14という番組に斉藤陽介、横尾太郎という2人が14という数字に2が足された。16? まさか。今日はプログラムの内容を変えまして特別スペシャルということで。ちょっと待ってくださいよ。新しい PV があるって聞いてますよ。ないよ。実機プレイも？いや。
A stage play.
今日14のね。
A stage play.
次のね情報は2021年までちょっと開発に集中またねしたいなと思っていて、ちょっとね10月下旬ぐらいに今ティザーサイトもないんで、ティザーサイトを開けて、ちょっとキャラクター周りとか世界観は情報出そうと思ってるんですけど、その後はもうちょっと開発に集中しようかなと思ってます。
許されない、そんな。
いや許されないっていうか、いやでも今回ちょっと頑張りはしたんですよ。なんだムービーレンダリングしたすごい映像とロゴ版はちょっと今回はそうじゃなくしたいなと思って、できるだけリアルタイムのインゲームで動いてる素材で、ただちょっときつくてやっぱ時期的には、まだ最適化とかそのチューニングとか全然やってないから結構しんどいんですけど、特に最近ねこの後すぐ出るタイトルと比較される。ただレンダリングトレーラーとかだとなんかこうじゃあ2035年にお会いしましょうみたいなコメント見たん実際アメリカとかでいやだから一応こうちゃんと動いてるものでなんとかしたいっていうのがあって、
なるほど。
そうなんですよ。なんでこう売りのところとか何も入ってないトレーラーなんでちょっとちゃんと作ってからねまた、いいですよね取締役の斉藤さん。それで
高井宏来てないの今日。いやだから
14の番組だから。
そうだね。
So yeah, there haven't really been any other interviews or anything other than that. There was there have been some interviews where people talked about a thing that they were working on, last year or whatever, that we can now ascertain were about this. But maybe it was a fever dream that I had. I feel like there was a joint statement by Yoshida and Sakai, the director again, who, like, I thought it was like on the official Twitter or something, where both of them had like a couple paragraphs. They talked about working on the game. I just tried to find it again to read to you guys, and for the life of me, I cannot locate it. So that's all I got for right now. Is that little interview where Taro asked a question that possibly he wasn't supposed to ask. Maybe he was. Impossible to say with him. Yeah, so some of you may have been expecting a more conventional trailer analysis for this. I just don't really do that anymore. Like, even if you go back and watch some of my older trailer analysis videos, which you shouldn't do, by the way, I don't recommend that you do that. Even if you were to go back and rewatch some of them, I feel like I always talked about this type of stuff in them, just not to the extent that we did today. Because this is honestly, this type of, the big picture stuff we've been talking about today is generally more interesting to me anyway than the content of individual trailers. And with this, there's not a lot to say, I've said everything that I would have said in a more conventional trailer analysis video, probably. I do wonder, though, on the speculation side, I wonder if people transform into these things, or if they summon them, who knows? Did Joshua turn into the bird? Or does he simply summon the bird? Does he control the bird? Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Could be interesting. Could be interesting to find out. Could also be uninteresting to find out. Gonna have to wait and see. I also have to wonder if it's gonna be non-linear in terms of its time presentation. Like if you jump back and forth from the past and the present, I guess, younger knight and gnarled revenge-seeking man for our protagonist. I wonder if we're going to jump back and forth, because we see gameplay of, both forms of our guy here. And if it's really RPG-centric, then it'd be weird to jump back and forth in time, because then you're effectively managing two characters, one who's perhaps higher level and one who's lower level, unless there's some plot detail that involves him getting power reduced at the beginning of, the older timeline or whatever. Of course, if it was more action-oriented, and it was just about what, the plot has granted you these abilities and these abilities, then maybe you could jump around in time a little bit more. I just wonder. The one thing is that some of the, I could be mistaken, some of the stuff during this large-scale battle, some of this stuff, not here, this stuff looks a little bit pre-rendered to me. Shots like this, there's so much going on. There's a lot of assets on screen. It's not at like the height of Visual Works' fidelity capabilities, but like if they were targeting something slightly lower that looked more like the rest of the game, or if it's literally unfinished, My point is I look at this and this could be, this could be part of an opening sequence that involves a large-scale battle FMV and then you flash back. Who knows? And it could also be just the story is told linearly, and we stick with the younger guy for a while, and then we jump forward to older guy. And they just don't feel like keeping that a secret because it's a significant enough part of the plot that they don't feel like it has to be a secret. We don't know what the game is yet. We don't know what this game is going to be. Maybe it takes a little while for Joshua to get killed. Maybe we run around as the younger knight for a while. Maybe he doesn't die in the first 2 hours or turn into the, whatever, the scene with the dragoon. Who knows? Who cares? Maybe this is you running around doing missions at the beginning of the game for something. Or maybe you set out on your trail of revenge as a younger guy and it takes longer than expected and we flash forward. Who knows? Again, this is the type of stuff that I'd rather just wait and find out, honestly. I don't know, man. Some big picture stuff going on with this game that's interesting to me. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's about all I have for today, folks. If we do this again, which we wouldn't do it with this game specifically for a while, since apparently we won't be seeing much more of this until 2021. If we do this again, it'll probably be over on our second channel, research runs, where for a little, like I said, it's mostly Let's Play videos over there. Hopefully a slightly higher variety of stuff over there soon. Stuff that's perhaps not quite polished enough for me to maybe put on here, or maybe a little bit too long-winded and rambling like this for me to feel like putting on here. And if we do something like this, assuming I have my internet fixed by then, I'd love to live stream it so I could talk with people in chat, while we were doing it or whatever. But that's future times, folks. And for today, I think that's all I got. I think that's all I have to say on the subject of Final Fantasy 16 for right now. I don't know, maybe you guys will have something to talk about in the comments and I'll leave some replies. Maybe you'll give me something more to talk about that I didn't think about. But, who knows? I don't know. That's all I got for you on video right now. Hopefully, more videos here on the Frustrated Jacob channel very soon about not Final Fantasy 16, playthroughs of Sonic Adventure, and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order ongoing over on Research Runs, and like I said, hopefully some other exciting stuff over there soon in both places. I'm doing pretty well on work right now. I got a lot of normal life things kind of not taking over as much as my schedule as they might have been in recent time, so I can spend a little bit more time working on YouTube stuff. So hopefully I'll be making more stuff and you'll be seeing more of me. But for right now, you're not seeing any more of me, because we're out ski. Adios.